So is that a me thing? Maybe. Hi friends and book lovers, and welcome back. As the title suggests, this video is a review for the first book in the Winnowing Flame trilogy by Jen Williams, and it is called The Ninth Reign. I have recently read this. We did a buddy read on the Shelf Space Discord, and I think also on the Shardathon Discord, the readathon that's going on for the month of April, and it was amazing, and I thought I would review it. I know that there are folks that are pretty curious about this series and either wanting to read it or about to read it next. So I figured if anyone's curious what my thoughts were in depth and what a spoiler-free review would be for this book before anyone gets into the series, this is what this review is for. I will be doing a review for the entire series once I read it, because like many of you know, if you read fantasy, the first book can be different than the rest of the series just because it's kind of the setup book and the introduction to whatever world you're diving into. So I do want to review the series as a whole once I read the next two books in this series. Alright, so the first thing I want to go over is what is this book about, because the first time that I read the synopsis, it didn't really help me out or even tell me anything about what the book was really about, but I will try to help break it down so that you get a better understanding of what you're getting into without too many spoilers, or without really any spoilers at all. Basically, the first paragraph tells us that the city of Ibora once glittered with gold, and now it's a city stalked by wolves. Tormund the Oathless has no taste for waiting to die, while the realm of his ancestors falls to pieces. Talk about a guilt trip. So basically we're following Tormund the Oathless. He is one of the main characters in this novel, and he has left Ibora because it is now a empty city and a lot of his ancestors have fallen ill, which we discover in the book. He ends up meeting the eccentric explorer, Lady Vincenza Vintage de Grazon. She offers him employment and he sees a way out. Then they're joined by a fugitive witch with a tendency to set things on fire. The prospect of facing down monsters and retrieving artifacts is preferable to the abomination left behind. So obviously Vintage is our other main character, and then this witch, which we discover her name is Noon, is our other main character. So there's three of them that we follow along with another person that lives in Ibora, who is Tormund's sister, and this is all information you're gonna find out within the first chapter of the book. We have a prologue before, and this is also laid out as well. And then the last part of the synopsis says, but not everyone is willing to let the empire collapse, and the adventurers are soon drawn into a tangled conspiracy of magic and war. The Jurelia are coming, and the Ninth Reign must fall. So obviously we have this collapsing empire, which is Ibora, and then these two warring parties. We have the Jurelia that are coming, and obviously that's like ominous and doom-filling, and the Ninth Reign, which you end up discovering what that means in the book. So I'm not going to spoil anything about that, but that is obviously a big part of the book, and it's a really fun thing to discover. When I discovered what it meant, I was like, that is so cool, and I honestly can't wait for more of that in the second book, and I cannot wait to start it. So that's basically the main premise, and it's pretty straightforward once you break it down, but I know I was confused, so I wanted to make sure that others weren't confused. We have these three main characters that end up meeting each other in various ways. They end up going hunting for these artifacts, and then they get drawn into this conflict that's going on with the fallen city of Ibora, and that is something that you're going to discover in the book itself. But that's basically what it's about. Now I want to go into the review portion of this. Again, I'm going to go over 5 things that I like to review. So the writing style, the world building, the plot, the characters, and then my general enjoyment of the book, which is very biased. I mean, everything in this review is going to be a little biased because it's all my preference, but I'm trying to be objective in certain ways so you guys get a good wholesome picture. The first thing I'm going to go over is the writing style, because honestly 16 pages into this 530 page book and I was like, I know I'm gonna love this. I love the writing style, and when I love a writing style like that, I know that I'm probably gonna want to read all of the author's work, and that is definitely the case with Jen Williams. I am definitely looking into all the other things that she's written and very curious about the rest of her works, and of course the rest of the trilogy. This is adult fantasy, so the writing style is not as easy as a YA, but it's still really accessible. It's really easy to read, it's really smooth, it flows really well. Obviously, it does remind me of kind of an older fantasy mixed with a modern fantasy type of story and type of writing and type of language that's spoken. So you do get that old fantasy feel. And I really enjoy that. And I feel like it really puts me in the mood in the fantasy setting because it's not as current or modern of the language that we use here. But there are some quips and some banter that is still pretty modern, and it's really fun to follow along with. So the writing style, A+. It's so good, and I just feel like she's one of those authors that I'm gonna have a really fun time exploring. So the next two are interwoven, and that is the plot and the world building. So obviously, as a first novel of a series, especially in the fantasy world, a lot of the times the world building and the plot are really interwoven. And in my last review, I reviewed another book, and I can link that up in the cards here. That world building and plot also was a similar kind of atmospheric laying out of all these different things that the characters don't know and that we're discovering with them. So in that sense, when you're discovering a lot about the world and a lot about the lore that's kind of forgotten by the world that you're in, but the characters are rediscovering it, it's not as info dumpy as another world might be, which is great. But at the same time, I do wish the world building unfolded just a teensy bit faster and we got just a little bit more. The last 100 pages or so, 130 pages or so, really do give you a download of like what happened and what's gone on and like how things kind of work. But for the majority of the book, obviously, they are hunting, they're finding artifacts, they're discovering the world, and they are trying to figure out all these things that happened in previous generations because those people are no longer there to speak to the history of the world. And so we have these big gaps and these big holes. There's obviously a lot of legends, a lot of myths in the world itself, but nothing concrete in terms of history. So we're trying to discover it. And on top of that, it's a fantasy world, but there are a lot of sci-fi elements that you feel, especially as the characters are discovering the world. It feels very scientific in parts and very thorough and investigational, much more than just stumbling upon things in a fantasy world. It does feel scientific at parts, which as a scientist, I really enjoyed, but if you're not into sci-fi and you don't really love the elements of sci-fi in a story, The Ninth Reign might not be for you. But if you do enjoy sci-fi or you kind of want to get into sci-fi, this definitely has some strong sci-fi elements and they're really interesting. The way they're interwoven with the fantasy aspects makes a lot of sense and it's almost seamless, like the most seamless fantasy sci-fi crossover that I've ever read, at least. And I really thought that was really impressive. And because the discovery of the world and the history is so pertinent to what's going on with this war and all these conspiracies that are happening, the plot is very much interwoven into discovering this and into meeting the other characters and into the convergence of all the storylines. So we have a few POVs, and at first you might not be interested in some of the character POVs, but you're going to be interested in all the character POVs at some point, so do not be disheartened if you're not interested in that character. You will be, just give it time. The POVs do converge into one at the end, which also does help the plot and helps it move forward. So you have all these different like parts and people that you're following. I think there's 3 or 4, and they do end up converging really seamlessly at the end, and the plot ends up blowing up, and it's just so, it's so good. I didn't expect the twist at the end to happen. I was very led on by what was being said in the book, and I was very convinced. But the twist at the end is so good, and I wasn't even able to fathom that. And I was really impressed by how that was done. And so obviously it makes you want to jump into the second book, and I'm trying really hard not to because I have other books to finish. But it's one of those endings where you're probably going to want to end up binging the series. So FYI, just make time for that, because if you're liking what I'm saying so far, you're probably going to want to binge the series. So A+ also for plot. I thought it was really good. It takes its time to build, to set a foundation in the world, what the plot is, who these characters are, what they need, what they do, etc. And then we go on to like the meat of the story. I think where it lacks a little bit was I wanted, like I said earlier, a little bit more world building. These books don't have a map, which can be a little frustrating for some of us, especially as they're describing different territories, but that wasn't even that big of a deal to me because at least I could imagine it in my head. But I do wish that certain things were explained. Now, it is a first book in a trilogy, so those things are probably going to be explained in the second and third book, and those I'm probably going to love even more, but I'm just really, I'm needy. I just want everything all at once in one book. So that's the only part of this book where I wish I had a little bit more, is just in the world building, because there are so many things that are left unexplained and so many things that I want to know. But at the same time, the characters don't know these things either, so it's hard to expect for us to know them. So I'm torn about that fact. I'm really torn about it, but it's so good. For all of you who haven't read it yet and who are about to read it or who have put it on their TBR, I'm so excited for you. Please, oh my gosh, once you read it, come to me, talk to me, DM me on Discord. I want to know all of your thoughts on this series and on this book. It's gonna be so good. The next item is the character work. So we have multiple POVs, and obviously when that happens, it takes a little bit of time to get invested into the characters. I think this book for many people, because you're not really sure what's happening or who these characters are or what they're doing, it takes you a few chapters to get into it. I would say, like, I think most people took about 4 or 5 chapters before they really got into the story. I loved it from the beginning just because I love that kind of mysterious, atmospheric world building where you're not really sure what's going on. And then the character work where you're not really sure what these characters are doing and what their intentions are, what they need, like what they're doing with their life. And as the story goes on, you learn more about the characters, more about the plot, and everything becomes more illuminated and discovered, which is really interesting. We do also have a part in the book where the characters have to pause for a specific reason, and you get to know a couple of the main characters a lot better as they're going through their background and who they are and the things that have happened to them and the traumas that they've endured. And for me, that character work was so good. Even though you're kind of paused in terms of a plot, it doesn't feel like nothing is going on. It feels like these are important tidbits that you need in order to move forward and in order to understand the characters and the motivations behind what they're doing and behind what's going to happen in the future. I also want to say that the characters in certain POVs show up in the memories of other characters, and the way everything is really interwoven, and of how it's a small world, 6 degrees of separation is done really well. We also get these little hints of culture, values, and importance where you are shown the value and what a character and a culture values, but then it's like sneakily snuck into another scene and you're caught thinking like, oh my gosh, this is a big cultural moment for this character. Like, it means that they're like really being vulnerable and showcasing themselves, and you might not catch it, but all those little like Easter eggs, I would watch out for them, because I had such a fun time reading them and discovering them later on in the book. And the foreshadowing is strong, the Easter eggs are strong, and just the character work and discovering each other and their values and the culture is just so interesting. Could I gush about it more? I absolutely freaking could. And the last piece of a review for me is the enjoyment. Do I need to talk about it at length? No. Will I? Probably, because it's me and I enjoyed it so much, and you all should know how amazing it is. It's so good. It does take you a little while to get into the book, like I said earlier, but it's so good. And I'm not always invested in the characters of the first book. And even if I am invested in a character, it's going to be one character. In this book, I'm invested in all of the characters. I'm invested in the characters that haven't even shown up in the book that much and who have shown up just in memories. I think it's so masterfully done. There are so many things, like I said, that are interwoven so beautifully that you might just miss. And I just encourage you all to like take your time and savor all the beautiful writing and the passages in this book, because if you're savoring it and you're paying attention to these things, chances are that the rest of the book is going to be really exciting, because you're going to be seeing things that were mentioned at the beginning of the book that you're now seeing fall into action later on in the book, and that for me is amazing. I also had a lot of fun in this world because it is so rich and it is somewhat complex. Not so complex that it's difficult to follow along unless you're not paying attention, in which case, why are you reading if you're not paying attention? That don't make sense. But it is so rich, and there are so many things that could happen, that it is a fun book to buddy read, and it is fun to discuss different conspiracies, different theories with the friends that you're buddy reading with. We've even discussed at the end of book 1 what we think is going to happen in book 2, and it's just been so much fun to do that. So if you have someone that you know who's interested in reading this book, I strongly recommend a buddy read, because it's going to be so fun to kind of guess where the world goes, to kind of guess what's going to happen and see what's going to happen next. And it's so good, guys. I hope that you all read this beautiful, lovely book. Also, the flop is so nice. So if you like to physically read and you get your hands on the trilogy physically, it's a beautiful flop. So that's it for my review, guys. It is a pretty gushy review, so if you weren't expecting that, you're welcome, because Gushy reviews are fun. I gave this book, well, I'm not even really sure the final rating because I keep fighting with myself. Right now on Goodreads, I have it at a 4.5 stars just because I want a little bit more from the world building, but I'm tempted to just give it a full 5 because it is just so good. I just always love the rest of the books in a series. The first book in a series for me is always the weakest because I just want to know more. So is that a me thing? Maybe. Maybe it's a me thing and I need to just take that out of my reviews. I don't know. But it's between a 4.5 and a 5 star. This book has like an average of 4 point something on Goodreads, so you can just see how amazingly well loved it is. Regardless of my 4.5 or 5 stars, it is a wonderful book. I feel like this series might end up being a favorites of the year once I read the next 2. I think I might love this so much. It gives me like 5th season vibes. So if you like N.K. Jemisin, you're probably gonna like this. If you like the 5th season, you're probably gonna like this book. The way that the world building is built and it's so mysterious and there's such a cloud over what's actually going on in the history and the characters kind of being in the dark about a lot of things reminds me of how From Blood and Ash opens up with our main character not really knowing too much, is how I feel these characters don't really know too much. I get, you know, sort of Shannara vibes. I get old fantasy vibes. I get the witches in The Throne of Glass, the 13. I get those vibes from the witch character. I also get the Downtown Abbey vibes from the vintage character. She is such a baddie, but she's like that old school proper baddie, if you know what I mean. There's just so many good tropes in this book that are common, but they're so well done, and it'll remind you of different bits and pieces of fantasy if you've watched a lot of fantasy, if you've watched a lot of fiction or read a lot of fiction, that it's just so enjoyable. And I can't wait for you guys to read it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy my content, please don't hesitate to subscribe for more reviews and bookish content.